Welcome, everybody. It's Helen Hillix, intuitive counselor and licensed therapist, and I have the distinct honor of interviewing Luke Kohen today. And you might have known him from the past as Aloka Hart, but he is now Luke Kohen, and I love his work. And that's why I wanted him on today. And I'll tell you a little bit more about him in a moment, but I want to talk briefly about why I wanted him. And the topic of sacred sexuality is so dear to my heart. And Luke has a lot of insightful, deep things to say about it. And I'm so excited about that reality. We are in a culture that does not promote sacred sexuality, that does not promote the integration of the masculine and feminine within us, and so many other problems, the religious messages that are so suppressive, and so much body shaming and so much pornography. There are so many distorted things going on about sexuality, and I feel so passionate about it, partly as all of my viewers and listeners know. I have a personal history of promiscuity and abortion and a lot of pain around sexuality in my past until I found the sacred path. So I really have a passion about it, to share about it, to dive in deep about it, and to help you with your own journey. And so that's why I'm passionate, and that's why I wanted Luke to be on today.
Pleasure to be here with you.
I'm so happy to have you. I discovered Luke, over a year ago on Instagram, and I just loved his mystical, deep, incredibly intelligent, articulate way of evaluating all the human problems, including sexuality. So he's the kind of person that could talk about any topic you bring up, but today he's going to help us out with the sacred sexuality. So Luke is an artist, a storyteller, an influencer, and a mentor. And I just want to welcome you so open-heartedly today, Luke, and thank you so much. Luke's been in Bali for a number of months, and he just moved to Hawaii a week ago. So I really appreciate you taking time out of your schedule and your brand new home to join us today.
Feels right to be here with you and everybody. Thanks for having me. Grateful to be able to dive in on these deeper subjects. It's such a part of our human experience. I really celebrate and look for and appreciate the things that uniquely make us human, that make us all related and all connected. And I think sexuality is probably one of the most foundational pillars of that human experience.
I agree with you. And one of the most misunderstood and misused pillars of connection. So I would love it, Luke, if you would start out with your personal story, and then I know from that we'll have many other questions that evolve.
Which chapter?
Whichever chapter you feel guided.
Yeah, sure. Essentially my story began in my last year of college. I had a healing crisis. So I was a very, very active and competitive athlete. I was a basketball player and a runner and a martial artist. And I was living, kind of a typical college lifestyle with alcohol and eating, cafeteria provided food, and wasn't really fully committed to my self-awareness or personal development in a modern context of how personal development is defined these days. But I was passionate about becoming a more capable athlete and martial artist, and that competitiveness of those sports was a kind of gauge for me to develop myself. And I had a minor spinal injury, but it was more my lifestyle, where my body just kind of gave out, and I didn't know that I had a hypersensitive nervous system. I didn't know that I was empathic. I had shut down all my intuitive gifts when I was about 8 years old, and so I had this accumulation of density in my life, and I got really depressed because the movement of basketball, the running, and the martial arts allowed me to access flow states, and those flow states were my break from my mind, were my break from the struggles of ego and other things that plague our human condition. That's where I found sanctity. And so when this happened, I'm 22 years old. and all of a sudden I'm walking with a cane out of nowhere. That's a pretty big blow to take at 22. And so, yeah, I got depressed, but
Especially as an athlete.
yeah, any age, if you go from a strong agility to suddenly being, restricted, it is very discouraging. And so, yeah, during this time, I had this cast iron teapot that I had bought myself as a birthday present a year prior. And I just had this organic draw to tea that was, even before this happened, that it lead up. I started drinking tea. I just felt this resonance with tea, and one day I'm drinking a cup of tea in my loft at the time, and I'm sitting down with a cup of green tea, and I entered what I call the living stillness for the first time in my life through sitting. I'd always found it through that movement. I'd always found it through the basketball, through the running, through the flow states of martial arts, and I found it in the stillness of sitting for the first time in my life. And I dropped so deep, and I woke up this memory of being a Taoist hermit in a past life. And I was in this cave, and I knew who I was. And then I came back to my, current lifetime experience as Luke, and came out of the stillness. And it was a timeless period had passed. It could have been 10 minutes, could have been 15 minutes, could have been 20 minutes, but it felt like an eternity had passed. Mm-hmm. And this cognition, self-awareness was rekindled, and I was like, this is what I need to devote my life to. This is the feeling I've looked for my entire life, and I committed all of my being to that feeling and the pursuit of how to embody those states of consciousness. And so shortly after, I was synchronously given a copy of Autobiography of a Yogi, and then one door after the next, and that was, over 12 years ago, and basically left college, graduated college that year, went right to India, never went into the 9-to-5 world, never entered, the typical societal path that you're supposed to take. I went deep into my seeker, and I've never looked back since, honestly.
Can I stop you just for a second? Because
sure.
I believe all of us have that in us.
Absolutely.
And I also believe that quiet stillness is what we all seek, and that sacred sexuality is based on that. Is that ability to be in that quiet stillness energy together during the sexual experience. And I wanted to say this because I want the audience to be able to relate to, and not go into their monkey minds telling them, well, I'm not like that. I wasn't a Taoist monk in a past life. But, we don't know what we were, number one.
Yeah.
But we all have this seeking energy inside us to be in
Sure.
that feeling of complete connection with the oneness.
Yes.
And that's reflected in what we want with each other, but we just don't know it.
Yeah, and also, anything that's unresolved in the emotional body comes up in the presence of stillness most of the time. There's these unique moments of satori, or whatever you want to call it, where you get the stillness without the baggage of anything else. But if that stillness, in my perception, is actually all pervading, it's the backdrop of consciousness on some level. And so it's kind of always there, and we keep ourselves stimulated, distracted, whatever, because when we actually come in contact with the stillness, it's very confronting to our egos and personalities, and then all the emotional pain that we carry within our energetic, in the face of stillness, it brings it right to the surface. And so, I think that we have a society and a culture that avoids stillness at all costs and seeks stimulation for many reasons. And it's not an overnight journey. I was blessed to have that moment. It doesn't mean that I like since then have had a journey of, I've had my challenges. It wasn't like I just stayed in that stillness. Since then, right. I've had to develop a relationship with it. Yeah. It's truly been a 12-year journey of forging a kind of negotiation of how much of that stillness I can let in a given moment or not. And I'm aware of it now. I'm like, okay, am am I filling the space? Am I interjecting stimulation onto a stillness? And that doesn't mean that excitement doesn't arise. It doesn't mean that I don't experience, exciting, eventful, stimulating things in my life. I love festivals. I love, concerts. I love performing on stage, and I love other things. But that stillness has become a kind of full circle journey from that point to now. It's alive, it's prescient, and it's available, and it's an ongoing relationship.
How I would integrate those realities as a therapist is, again, back to the concept of oneness. In the oneness, we have stillness, we have pain, we have excitement, we have stimulation, we have everything, sadness, all of those human realities. And I was interested in what you were saying about, I try to gauge how much of that I can handle in any given moment. Can you say a little bit more about that? And I'd like to dive back into the
Sure. It's not necessarily handle. It's how much. I call it. It's a negotiation, right? Like, so I love this word negotiation. Is something that has been a big part of my mentoring in bioenergetics therapy and other things. Is sort of the negotiation between higher self and ego, or inner child and adult. Like, there's these parts of our holistic nature that are seemingly in conflict. Are in opposition sometimes, or in conflict within ourselves. We could have a really deep desire and even commitment towards something wholesome, and yet be drawn to something less wholesome by a subconscious mechanism or whatever. And so the part of us that's committed to wholeness, and the part of us that has the default sabotage programs, there isn't a negotiation. That word just feels appropriate to how to gauge those two aspects of ourselves. And so what I meant was, I'm not in a struggle with silence. I'm in a negotiation with silence. How much of it I can allow in to my experience at a given time, because it's all pervading at this point in my life. I feel it as a backdrop of reality, more so than thoughts, most so than other things. It's just kind of there and pervading. And so I get to gauge how much I allow in. And sometimes I have very active resistance to allowing stillness into my experience. I don't want to, because there's really nobody there when you allow it in. There's no real personality or ego. There's just presence, and we kind of dissolve into it,
I totally,
and so
totally get that. It's the ego resistance. It's the ego resistance to giving up.
It's self-identity.
Yeah. So that seems to me like a perfect segue into telling us about your old sexual experiences, what you've learned in the past, and where you are with that now, integrating exactly what you're talking about.
Sure. Yeah. I'm it's growing up as a man in our modern American culture was not easy, especially with a high level of sensitivity, and also not being circumcised, which has been a whole area of research and understanding as well, and how that's played into the distortions in our world, circumcision. So for me, I had to, I found porn in my dad's drawer when I was like, I'd say like somewhere between 10 and 12, and so that was like my introduction to sexuality. Really was these
Very
like
common.
really complex. Yeah, this is probably 90% of I don't know how many kids get the benefit of their parents actually sitting them down and being like, this is
Exactly.
or they try and it's super awkward, and the kids just kind of feel the awkwardness of their parents' shame and discomfort of talking about these things.
That's so true. And so it's like, that's enough, thank you.
Yeah. And so for me, I mean, I remember my first crush when I was like 7 on this girl in my class, and being like, what is this, and super curious about it, and having this natural pull, and the overall circumstances of my journey as a teenager in New York City. I did everything as soon as possible. Like I smoked my first cigarette. I like smoked my first joint really young. I lost my virginity at 13 or 14. So there was this like desire to be older, faster. for whatever reason. And I think that continues. That trend is like each generation is doing everything a little bit earlier. But yeah, it was a complete distortion of what I was taught around sexuality through that. And I think there's, if I try to put myself into my experience back then and around the early conditioning of sexuality, there's this cultural code amongst men that is like, don't open your heart because you put yourself at risk. And the more women you sleep with, the better positioning you have for, power and sort of prestige, not only amongst men, but within the society. So, this idea of, where I grew up in New York City was like, there was a little bit of a hip hop culture or I was on the borderline with the ghetto. And so there's, some of my earliest mentors were crack dealers and, hip hop artists that were like my big brothers. And so don't catch feelings was the phrase, don't catch feelings.
Wow.
Don't catch feelings. That's a really
like a disease.
Interesting. Yeah. Like you're doomed if you open up. And so,
and of course, I think you're a very sensitive, intuitive guy, and you're saying don't catch feelings. And so
yes,
what an inner conflict that must have had. And I love the way you said it about the more women you sleep with, the more power you have. And so, and you can only do that if you cut off the intuitive emotional.
If you cut off your own feminine.
Exactly, which is the intuitive emotional side of yourself.
Feeling side. Yes.
And that's our whole culture, right? I mean, that's our whole culture, is go for the power.
Yeah.
The perceived power, of course, it's not real power, but go for the perceived power.
It's protection. It's like you said, it's perceived power to have more leverage in the circumstance, which is actually a thwarting of vulnerability and therefore true intimacy. And so I think that, the layers of distortion and layers of conditioning are so profound that like we have to just kind of peel the onion as we go through the subject, and unpack it and explore it, what the typical, masculine heart, or, I feel like each culture, modern culture, brings its own flavor of distortion, because the subject is so vast, and we each have our own subjective relationship to sexuality and to our own wounding. And so what I'm feeling careful of in this moment as I share, and I tune into to really feel what's authentic to share in this moment, is like this subjective relationship with all of these things is so nuanced. You throw the word sex out there, and it's actually gonna mean 100 different things to 100 different people.
Absolutely.
And so how do we unpack cultural distortion, like as a meme? What does that even mean? Because we don't actually have an embodied example. Like most of us, I'd say 98% of us weren't given an example of healthy masculine feminine relating dynamics. No, most of us weren't given an embodied example of a man in his heart and a woman in her power, authentic power. When I say power, for me, to just go into this idea of subjective words, power to me, authentic power, is something that arises from soul. It's an internal expression of power. It's not an externalization of power. Power in our modern world usually gets associated with externalization. So that means money. That means the ability to exercise violence, and things like that. That becomes equated with power, but that's actually distorted power. And so true power for me is the power of like a Martin Luther King Jr., Christ, the kind of internal soul power that overcomes external power with the deep internal power. So most of us haven't been given an example of what that looks like, other than some of these figureheads. And then, if that's one example of distorted power, then love is also one of the most distorted things that we've been given an example of. So, I think in order to unpack sex, we have to unpack power, we have to unpack love and the distortions around those two things in order to come into a shared reality around, what sacred sexuality could even be remotely perceived as someone investigating it for the first time, or wherever they're at in their journey. We don't have any context for it, is what I'm saying. As a culture, there is no context for sacred sexuality.
Well, exactly.
Whatsoever.
But when you say what is the cultural distortion, we can't even say what that is. Well, you said it. You said it exactly, though, is that 98% of us have no reference for what is healthy sexuality. So that in itself, it's sort of like, the definition by absence. But it's true, is that the cultural distortion is the fact that we don't even know what it is. Because we've been taught that it's power. We've been taught that it's lust. We've been taught that it's domination. We've been taught that it's submission. We've been taught that it's seduction. I mean, we've been taught that it's security. I mean, blah, 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 blah. We could just go on forever, couldn't we, about what we've been taught that it is not.
Totally. Yes. Yeah. And it is the most powerful, I think it's one of the most powerful things on earth is sex. The ability to create a new life, the hormonal impact that it can have through pair bonding, through bonding, is like a drug. The oxytocin, all these things. So there's a million different directions. I guess that we could go is what I'm feeling, and I'm really tuning into what feels true to share as we unpack this subject. Like, what would serve the listeners? What feels true to share of my own experience, and how do we unpack the nuances of a distorted culture, and start to move towards this concept of sacred sexuality, if it's something that we haven't experienced yet. I felt an intuitive desire for it in my soul, similarly where it was like part of my own soul's prescience was penetrating this lifetime. I kind of had this fantasy that I would be with a partner actually teaching and exploring sacred sexuality when I was really young. I was around, around the same time I discovered porn. I was already having this internal experience of almost this pre-coded understanding of divine union. Like there's a counterpart out there, and she's going to unlock something in me, and we're going to share this magical thing. I didn't have any context for it. It was just kind of innate knowing. It's kind of a bizarre thing for a 10-year-old to feel.
It is kind of a bizarre thing, but you know what? It's addressing the reality that we come from oneness.
Yes.
And that we have an innate longing to return to oneness. And your sharp mind was able to kind of interpret that as, I wonder if this sex thing could bring me to that oneness. Before you go on with that, I wanted to go back to something you said earlier about circumcision. I've never talked to someone on the show about circumcision or lack of circumcision, and because you mentioned that had a big effect on you. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because I know
that is a can of worms.
I know it's a can of worms, but I just want to, for my own edification, and I know if I don't know that much about it, then other people that are listening don't either.
All right, so I'm gonna share this publicly in this format for the first time. Because it's time to be shared, and it is time to be talked about. So the way that I understand it through my elders and the different schools of self-mastery that I've studied, the way that we understand circumcision is that it was intentionally imposed to engineer soldiers. So when you instill a trauma that early on of that nature, it creates a supreme distrust of the feminine. So you're supposed to come into this world feeling safe and held by your mother, but instead you're taken from your mother and you're genetically mutilated in agonizing pain. If anyone's ever said, circumcision doesn't hurt babies, they don't remember, it's complete BS.
Yeah.
So my dad actually accidentally walked in on a baby being circumcised in the hospital, and it completely freaked him out. My mom was already leaning towards it not happening, but he was like, there's no way we're doing this to our son. It's like, I just walked into the room, like, that was horrifying. What the F, And so, I was spared that trauma. I mean, birth trauma is a whole thing. There's, basically human beings are all managing varying degrees of trauma, whether they know it or not. And so circumcision is actually one of the most profound and very intentional traumas that was instilled to engineer soldiers. When I say, and I'm going to describe what I mean by engineering soldiers, and the culture of war, and where the culture of war is systemically stems back to the separation of the masculine and feminine. And so we've actually been pitted against each other as genders since the fall of the Egyptian priests and priestesshoods, where this was actually, sacred sexuality was originally practiced and taught as a path of self-realization and awakening. And so when circumcision was imposed and really withheld in the Roman Empire and passed on since then, the trauma of that much pain and the distrust of the feminine is like, wow, I'm supposed to feel safe. Mom just betrayed me. I'm being, mutilated. Now that deep hidden trauma has so much rage in it. It has so much betrayal. It has so much distrust of the mother wound that also separates people from Earth, because Earth Mother is similar. So now you have this instinctual betrayal from mom that then went through the military sort of culture can be redirected to justify the taking of life. Now, someone that's been circumcised is more easily programmable. And I'm not saying this for all men. It's totally redeemable. It doesn't mean you're doomed. It doesn't mean, there's nothing to be ashamed of. It's something to be aware of and to actually inquire around, what am I actually holding if I have been? Like, what is this, to actually like tune in for yourself and go down the rabbit hole of where this may apply to you. But in general, from the research and from actually, like, I actually had a friend who was so ashamed of his uncircumcised, because we were like, if I was one child in a room of 30 children, I was the only circumcised person in America. In Europe, it's less so. In Brazil, in South America, it's less of a thing. But in America, which is the modern Rome, I would say I don't know what the actual statistics. I only know what I experienced in locker rooms, that out of like 30 kids, I was the only one of maybe 2 kids that weren't circumcised, right? And so I actually had a friend who was so ashamed of his uncircumcised lingam that he had the operation on himself when he was like 14 or 15. And I saw the shift from his sensitivity to more of like, let's say, wounded toxic masculine, like more aggressive, more, like I saw the shift firsthand. I witnessed the shift in his energetics and his emotional state. And so that
kind of aren't you kind of saying that it's the kind of integration of the reality of violence in life, and that you're supposed to embrace and accept the reality of violence?
Yes, but what I'm pointing at on a deeper level is that it severs men from their feminine. So it's from externally, it's the betrayal of mother and the unsafety, and now the suppressed rage of that experience being redirected to justify war and killing and aggression, and then a severing from their own feminine, because the sensors, like that is essentially the male clitoris. It has the same amount of sensors. There's the same amount of actual receptors as a clitoris. So that gets numbed out, right? And so if that's numb, that's got to impact the emotional body on some level. And so the fact that we lose that, most men lose that, is a form of intentional severing from the feminine. So what I'm saying is that there was an agenda for a permanent state of war on our planet that came hand in hand with circumcision. And so one of the things that kind of distilled this for the dark priesthood of Egypt, that basically was behind a lot of the wars that spanned out Rome, was basically soldiers would come back from war. They would go to one of these kind of sacred sexual healing temples. It wasn't like prostitution in the way that we know it now. It's very different. And they would have a heart opening, and they wouldn't want to fight anymore. They wouldn't want to go to war because their heart opened through this divine sexual energy that they experienced from these priestesses that were embodying a right relationship with the sexual energy, knowing how to wield it for healing, for awakening the soul, awakening the energy. Connection. And so they witnessed this. They said, oh wow, like if there's no soldiers, there's no war. We have to prevent this. And they literally targeted when the patriarchy fully took hold of our planet, it was the targeted attack on the temples of Isis, that where the sacred sexual magic was being taught. That was the first, enactment of external power, was to destroy these temples, because if you have men with their hearts open, they won't want to go to war.
I love that, Luke. I mean, that just resonates through every cell of my being, and that I want to really emphasize, not just about circumcision. I mean, because it's like female circumcision. It is the same thing happening in primarily in Africa, but other places too. Is the same thing. It's like the attempt at the patriarchy to dominate, whether it's making soldiers or it's making women submissive or whatever it is, or the far right Christian of the purity movement of, shame about sex, or the Catholic.
The most natural thing in the world is
exactly
evil and bad.
Yeah, and the Catholics saying that masturbation is a mortal sin. I mean, it's just beyond belief sometimes, the attempts to control society through manipulation of sexuality.
Yes,
and
it was very intentional.
So far.
Because the source of power that comes from it is so huge, and has been so largely distorted, that when it comes into a healthy or sacred relationship, as we're using the word sacred to signify an alignment with the natural laws of the universe that benefit all beings. Like, there's no harm done, right? We'll say alignment, we'll say harmony, we'll say, because the word sacred could be as charged as the word God, in subjective.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what does that even mean for a lot of people? What is sacred? If there's not a form of organic reverence that has been cultivated, sacred it's a meaningless word. So what was discovered by a lot of these beings that kind of impose some of these norms on our world, that carried into our modern time, was the way that we could awaken some of our soul energy and the full bioresonance of our energy system, our chakras, our meridians, our energy body, which that's a whole thing to unpack in and of itself, if you believe in that or not. There's plenty of research that talks about these things. So if anyone's kind of like energy bodies, but when you use sacred sexual practices, and when you work with some of these tools of the ancient Egyptians, what they would use to wake up, what they called sekim, what the Taoists did to build what they call the immortal body, or the immortal chi body, this light body, what the Kero called the rainbow body. There's all these traditions, shamanic or yogic or otherwise, across the planet, that all had a different name for the life force energy, and then where sacred sexuality was taught and utilized to strengthen that energetic body and that light body. And so the suppression of sexuality and the control and the dominance of the feminine, all of it was designed to disconnect humanity from their God force, their God power, the creative life force.
Right. I love that too, because again, what you're saying is so much a description of how the patriarchy has dominated the masses, is by disconnecting us from our own personal connection to the spiritual powers, to higher consciousness, to whatever. And that's
very intentional.
Oh, absolutely, very intentionally, and it's absolutely still going on. That's how I think of sacred, is that we are connected to one another, and we are connected to higher consciousness while we are connecting to one another. That sexuality becomes an experience of oneness, and not just ego gratification.
Totally, or just just the primal release, which has its place in this beautiful part of sacred sexuality, but it's only one aspect of 9 aspects. When you're moving into sacred sexual connection with another person who is also awakened their energy, you can become a battery for each other, and actually heal disease and awaken the cells. If men have to learn how to circulate and not ejaculate, and these are teachings that are taught by the Taoists and other systems, of how to move the seminal fluid up the spine, and open the pineal and pituitary glands. I mean, this is all ancient yogic sciences that were used for self-realization that has been suppressed knowledge, and it's coming back. Neo-tantra, all these tantric systems, and a lot of it's distorted too, with polyamory and other things. But the deeper codes of sacred sexuality were focused on divine union and to fully awaken each other's light body. And this is, according to alternative texts. And again, this is a very alternative narrative for a lot of people, but Yeshua Christ, also known as Sananda, Yeshua's consort or divine partner was actually Mary Magdalene. And so she was kind of written out as, she was documented as a disciple. There's a lot of different interpretations of her. She was a direct descendant of disciple of the temples of Isis. She learned sacred sexual magic. She helped Christ achieve his level of self-realization, his light body, so to speak, his ability to, perform miracles was also because of the feminine initiations that he received in Egypt, the tantric initiations he received from Babaji in India, and then practicing that with Magdalene raised the cellular resonance of his life force so high that he could achieve these kinds of miracles.
Which, of course, is completely suppressed.
Yeah, this is like the last thing they want anyone to know, and this would freak out most, born agains.
Yeah, whom wouldn't be listening to this show anyway.
Yeah.
So we're safe.
Not worry.
One thing that I want to address is, and I don't know how you feel about it, but I honor all the ancient wisdoms, and I appreciate everything foundational that they're bringing to us and the reawakening of those wisdoms. And I feel like it's still evolving. We're not,
absolutely,
just as much as we're not stuck with the interpretation of the Bible. It's like, you think God has not evolved in 2,000 years, that whatever was put in words 2,000 years ago, it's just crazy.
By men.
Exactly. But that all of it, the Isis wisdom, the tantric wisdom, it's all still evolving.
Yes.
And that's part of the whole paradigm, is that we have to understand how much that reflects ourselves and our own sexuality, is that we're always evolving.
Yes. I love that. I mean, I think that's a really important context to set in the modern pursuit of self-development, sacred sexuality, self-realization, whether you've gotten onto the path to heal yourself like I did, or whatever draws you. I think that piece of context is really beautiful. And I kind of frame it with clients of like, can you give yourself permission to be in a discovery process? We're all in discovery always. And if we give ourselves permission to be in discovery, then we're not like imprisoned by fixed systems or ideologies. All the things that I shared.
Including shaming ourselves for not being in the place where we think, quote unquote, we should be. I mean, that's another aspect of sexuality that is so profound, is the shame. The shame of what we have done, or the shame of what we haven't done, or all of that. There's just so much shame around it. And that so much relates to what you're saying about, can you give yourself permission to be in discovery?
Yeah.
Eliminates that.
It can. It certainly can. Shame, the way that I understand shame from the core energetics kind of paradigm is it's kind of like the really sticky like seal on a bunch of other feelings. It's like we don't touch that, and we actually avoid this whole other set of shadow by not touching that. But if we go into our shame, we actually pop open this whole wellspring of deeper lineage wounding, or even deeper sets of emotions that can allow more of ourselves to come online. Because if we avoid that, then we're like actually avoiding part of our greatness as well. This idea of the light shadow and the dark shadow,
that is so profound, so important. And I have found that working with people specifically on the issue of sacred sexuality, that they have done all these other things before they come to me. They've gone to workshops, that promise spiritual evolution or sacred sexuality or whatever, but they universally have put the lid on all of that pain that is actually manifesting with disconnection to begin with.
Yeah.
And we're so afraid of pain in our society too. I mean, that's another one. I'm sure that there's some, philosophical connection between the patriarchy and the fear of diving deep into your pain. But it's certainly a cultural prohibition to sacred sexuality is the fear of emotional pain.
Totally. And yet people experience it whether they avoid it or not. It's an inevitable part of life.
Absolutely. It's
it's
blocking your sexuality, for one thing.
Yeah.
I'm sure have you seen that with your clients, Luke, where people will come to you and say, we're disconnected in this way or that way, and they want you to give them a formula for, how do we have better sex, when all they really need is to release some of that trauma and feel more aligned, and the sex takes care of itself.
Yeah, I think that our number one responsibility to create fulfillment and happiness in our life is to actually address our trauma truly and fully. There's no other magical, and I'm speaking as someone that's gone through a lot of really deep, more esoteric initiations, but at the end of the day, the things that initiated me more than anything were relationship from my path. It was a breakup, cracked me open to my shadow more than, 5 cups of ayahuasca and 10 sweat lodges. It was
I love that.
It was oh shit.
I love that. I just
humbling.
Love that, because it is so true. And we haven't really talked about that specifically, but that relationships are such a portal to self-awareness. I mean, I remember when I met my husband, I was 57 years old already, and I'd been a therapist for many decades at that point. And I thought, I'm pretty healed. And then I met my husband. It's I am a fucking
next layers.
I am a fucking, I just saw all this crazy, crazy stuff that I was feeling and manifesting. And I would never have known it if it weren't for relationship.
Yeah. Yeah. So from my understanding, we're in the Aquarian age, right? So there's a lot of different ideas of what the age of Aquarius means, but in terms of a path of self-mastery, the rules are a little bit different this time around than it was the Piscean age. And the Piscean age is where all the yogic teachings and, removing ourselves from the world was actually the path we needed to take at that point. And now we're in an age of Aquarius where we need to utilize those tools, but actually come back into connection and come into the world, come into society, come into relationships. And so a lot of spiritual people have a really hard time facing their humanity. And that's kind of the essence of the challenge for a lot of spiritual folks is all the ideologies that got wrapped up in the Piscean era. All those teachings are actually outdated, and they're not relative to the relational dynamic that actually addresses all the karmic feelings that we sought to control in all those other lifetimes. And you can see lifetimes, however you want to frame it in culturally in our society, you could hit it from many different perspectives, but essentially the energy is the same. Is that there's unaddressed feelings that need to be met in connection, that transform us from the inside out, that allow us to have more access to ourselves, more fulfillment, more pleasure, more love, more of our gifts. And so if we're unwilling to go into the shadow, we can't actually experience the life that we want to live fully. And so a lot of the spirituality actually becomes a nuanced way to try to control and bypass the pain, just get to the light part. If I chant this many mantras, or I do, drink this much medicine, I'll magically not have to deal with these set of feelings that are really the core of what's going on underneath my entire reality and identity.
I totally
so the resistance is that. Understandable.
Yeah, I mean, we all want spiritual bypass.
Yeah.
That's the short way of saying that to me, is that people who are unwilling. I used to work with a client who meditated all the time and had these wonderful, blissful meditative experiences, but he couldn't bring it into reality. And it's what the hell use it if you can't bring it into your relationships and into reality? And that's what you're saying, is that
totally
right? Is that we need to bring it into reality. Reality is not separate from the spiritual world. It's all part of the oneness.
Yes, and that's the hardest thing for a lot of spiritual people to embrace, and actually the deeper pattern interruption of you talk about patriarchy inlaid the idea that God is somewhere else.
Right.
The feminine is everything that's form, Shakti, Prakriti, whatever you want to call it. The all-pervading form is the divine feminine. And so we were actually, whether you're into religion or not, a lot of these older Piscean spiritual paths make God this like invisible Godhead, formless, Shiva consciousness. And then we forget all the form around us as the other half of God. And that's what we got severed from in the more the religious indoctrination and distortion fields that were overlaid onto humanity. And so, that's why there's an avoidance of relationship, because it is God right in front of you being like, hello, you have something unresolved that you need to look at. Ding,
Exactly.
ding, ding, ding.
Instant feedback, right? Instant feedback. And it's like people, and we are so taught, the other side of shame, of course, is blame. And so, when all the shame gets triggered from the instant feedback from God, the universe, whatever, the instant feedback comes that, you've still got shit to deal with, honey. When we get that, then we want to instantly cover up that shame by blaming the other person. Well, you're just an asshole. No wonder I'm a bitch. You're an asshole.
Yeah. Shame, blame, and manipulation, all the survival mechanisms that really are just really nuanced protective mechanisms from the hurt that we're unwilling to feel.
Yeah, I just love what you're saying. I mean, tying it all together with, the separation. I mean, this is how I understand the universe, Luke, is that we have the energy of separation in the universe and the energy of connection. And that it's no different than the energy of the masculine and the energy of the feminine. It's like there really is no duality. We need both sides of everything. And sacred sexuality can only come when we understand the collapsing of those dualities and how that relates to the physical world. It's like, let's keep it grounded. It has to be manifested in this physical world for it to do any good.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that's a whole other thing to unpack. I mean, I do think that there are those that are predisposed to impact physical reality from an energetic standpoint, as everything's energy, and that it's nuanced, because there could be the bypass version of that, and there's the the reality of that prayer can impact life. It's nuanced, but I think what I would say is in order to be integrated, in order to be an integrated soul, it has to show up in reality. It has to show up in relationship. And
right. I don't mean that you have to get out of that and into this. I don't see it that way at all. I agree.
They're not separate for you anymore.
Exactly. That it's all energy, but that we get to remember to bring that energy into connection bodies. Right. While we're having sex.
Yeah.
And, it's such a different experience, having had tons of sex without it and having sex with it. You can really tell the difference. And I know you can.
Yeah. When the energy of love is involved, it's a game changer. You can have the physical act and be safe from the attachments or not catch feelings. But the true tantric levels of bliss and divine union and transcendence can really happen in that space of sexuality with another is profound and requires the energy of love, and it requires a type of vulnerability that unless you've sat with your own wounds, unless you've built a relationship with your own pain and your relationship with your own pleasure, you can't actually bring that into relationship with another person in a stable way. And so sacred sexuality, from my perspective, is the willingness to be with whatever is there and show up for yourself and the other. So like basically, you want to develop your own connection to source and your own connection to your own subconscious, your own, physiological energetic makeup. Everyone runs sexual energy different. Everyone has a different sense of desires. And my biggest inquiry around sacred sexuality has always been what is the difference, around this has to do with like polarity and desire and attraction and sexual attraction. How much of it is arising from soul, and how much of it is arising from wounding, and where they overlap?
I love that. I love that inquiry.
That's like the inquiry. Yeah.
I love that inquiry. I mean, I really love the way you're saying that, is how much of our attraction arises from the soul, from the recognition of the oneness in the God in each other, and how much of it comes from wounding, from, she reminds me of my mother who rejected me, and therefore I'm really attracted to her because I want her to want me. That, I love that, and I love that distinction, because, you know, as we're coming to the end of our interview, I really, that is so powerful, Luke, that distinction, we cannot even approach that question until we're willing to embrace that the way we were hurt and wounded in our in the past is still manifesting.
Yeah, you know, it's like sacred sexuality can be, it's like graduate school, but that you can start studying now. You know what I mean? It's not unavailable. It's just like when I look at like the evolution of different things that I've gone through in stages of development and like healing and facing, you know, core wounds and really deep loss and other things. The deeper reality of my initiations came from unraveling codependency. I could bypass and default into all my esoteric, multidimensional, you know, soul-based lineage stuff and position myself there. But life humbled me through bringing me back to the reality that I had unresolved codependency and abandonment issues and engulfment issues, and that the relational work is what grounded me as a soul. It brought me into a quality of integration that I could then, from that place, actually practice sacred sexuality effectively with partners or lovers or my beloved now, you know, in a way that's actually sustainable, with honoring, and doesn't create a severing on the other side of it. And I think that, you know, all the different ways that we manage loss or the fear of loss, or that all the associations of beliefs that love can lead to loss, all these things, we have to clean that up in our own subconscious. We have to be willing to go into the pain and deal with it, because it does lead to more reward. It is worth it. It is worth facing and healing the trauma, because we get that level of fulfillment on the other side. And so, you know, for those out there that are excited or interested in practicing sacred sexuality, know that's like the master course, and that's what we're all working towards, myself included. I'm not fully there yet. I don't know if I'll fully be there, but I know what the work is in relationship to it, and that's where the meat is. That's where the juicy stuff is, and it's not about getting a cookie at the end of the day. There's not going to be any like magical validation that you get from the universe. It's not glamorous, but it's worth it. So
I love that. That is so it. You know, it's a process. It's absolutely a process, and it's like the good news and the bad news. The good news is the process never ends. Yes. And, you know, for some people, that's the bad news, because they want the end result. But that's, you know what? It's like if you get an end result, then you stop growing. You stop having the deliciousness of the inquiry and the adventure. But absolutely, I love what you're saying about it's forever. It's the process of forever diving into ourselves. Yes. And I wanted to say something about the loss. Isn't that our essential fear? Is that fear of dying, the fear that we're going to lose ourselves in some way. You know, we're going to be left alone in the darkness. You know, however we think of that, it really is the fear of separation. And
I think it's one half of the equation. It's like the yin and yang, you know. I think for one half, it's abandonment and the great loss of the other, and the other is to be completely consumed.
Yes, I love that.
Those are the two sides of the yin yang of relating in sacred sexuality.
Well, and they're both the fear of losing ourselves, though, whether it's losing ourselves in the separation, or it's losing ourself by being consumed by the oneness.
Sure.
But we have this longing, like you're saying, we have a longing to lose ourselves in the oneness.
Yeah.
And we have this terror of being left alone, but then we have the terror of being consumed and the longing to be an individual. So, humanity is, exactly. And so I love what you're saying, because we get to make friends with the vulnerability of losing ourselves on both sides. We get to make friends with that.
Sometimes we have to lose ourselves to find ourselves. But if we're not willing to take the journey, then how do we know?
We always have to be willing to lose ourselves to find ourselves. I mean, that's exactly what you're saying, is that we always have to be willing to lose ourselves by diving into the pain, by being willing to dive into love and experience them rejecting us. Whatever it is, our most desired ecstasy comes from our willingness to dive into our deepest fears.
And our most ecstatic experiences happen outside of our crystallized identities. It's in the rapture of orgasm. There's no one there. It's just creation. All the things that we actually long for in that oneness. The person seeking it doesn't actually even exist in those moments. So it's kind of an irony. It's kind of a game that we play with ourselves.
It is.
Or God's playing with himself or herself. God got us. It's there's a lot of paradox riddled within the spiritual journey, and the more that we can ground it in relationship and really be with the human parts of ourselves, I think the not necessarily the easier, but the more grounded and the more relatable we can even be with our own spirituality or our own healing journey. Because when it comes to the bigger ideals, a lot of people seeking enlightenment, thinking that'll satiate their suffering of certain emotions, and it's not true. Just like we come magically awakened and there's no more feelings. These kinds of ideals create a lot of nuanced suffering within someone's spiritual journey, and then you take an isolated spiritual journey and then you bring a mirror into that equation and you double your process, you amplify your process in relationship. So I think in the Aquarian age, relationship and relating is the accelerated path of awakening. I think that, whatever commitment we have to our own spirituality gets doubled with the presence of another. When done with self-commitment, that person doesn't become a replacement for something that we're not giving ourselves. That person isn't, here to save us, but the relational fabric of that mirror can certainly amplify and speed up the places that we haven't seen in ourselves. And that's what we need to look at in order to become whole.
So let me summarize.
That's a path of sacred sexuality in and of itself.
Yeah, let me see if just want to summarize what you're saying, and then I want you to tell the audience how they can reach you.
Sure.
How they can find you. So the spiritual seeking is very powerful on its own, and it's amplified in the Aquarian age by us relating to someone else intimately and being mirrored with them accelerates our spiritual growth as well as accelerating our emotional growth, because it's right in front of our face. And so it's that integration, it's the integration of the spiritual, the emotional, the physical, the mental, that we are all being challenged with in our evolutionary process now.
Yeah, the individual spiritual journey of self-responsibility is amplified with others. So, put it this way, that community has become the guru. Community is the guru, and your partner is your teacher.
Okay, I love it. I love it.
That's what Tantra is now.
Yeah, that relates directly to what is sacred sexuality, and you can begin to experience it now. I really love
with
that.
Yourself. Yeah, with yourself.
With yourself and with your partner. Yeah. So let's hear about where people can find you and how people can work with you if they feel so inclined.
Sure. Yeah. Right now I'm building out my new website, so it's not live yet, but the best way is Instagram at the moment, which is at Luke Kohen, LukeKohen. Kohen with a C. you can message me on there. I respond to everybody. So, you know, I'm not taking out a lot of clients these days, but if, you know, I will work with people if there's a resonance and it feels true, you know, to do so. But, you know, there's lots of content that touches on these things, and I'm always sharing stories and videos, and it can be, and part of why I'm here in Maui now is I'm creating a lot of content here, from music to stories to, you know, transmissions about different subjects like this. So if you want to stay in touch, that's the best place to find me. Yeah.
Okay, so at Luke Kohen with a K. And what is your website going to be when it is live? Do you want to?
LukeKohen.com. Yeah.
Okay, so it'll be lukekohen.com.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Luke, for taking
my pleasure. Thank you. Yeah, great to be here with you.
And I really appreciate
I know we've been trying to do this for a while.
We have been trying to do this for more than a couple of months, you know, because you were in Bali for quite a while. And
yeah, 6 months.
Didn't have good internet. So it finally happened, and it happened at a perfect time. And I thank you. I thank you, and I thank you for the work that you do in supporting humanity to integrate the spiritual and the emotional, mental process, and all that you do for all of us. So because connection and community is the guru. So I appreciate the part that you're playing in that.
Thank you. It's a total pleasure and honor to share anything from my journey that could inspire or help anyone. It brings a lot of joy to my experience. So.
Well, thank you so much, Luke.
Beautiful day. Aloha, everybody. Thanks for listening.
Aloha. And thank you, everybody. Love you, and I'll see you next week.